We are the dispossessed of Scotland. We, the Gaels, made the country that is called Scotland, and for the last 600 years we have been pushed back into the remote and inaccessible parts of this kingdom until there is only a little remnant of us, but we remember our former greatness. And that is part of our problem.
The Hebrides, the last windswept battleground for the heart and culture of the Gael. For from here, there is simply nowhere left for him to retreat. This land is among the least fertile in Europe, yet 30,000 people still cling to it for survival. To be a Gael, they say, is never to be far from tears. And if shed tears could make it fruitful, this barren land would be paradise indeed. But now, after decades of neglect, a fragile new self-confidence is stirring in the Gaeltacht. It's the start of another school day for the children of Slate in Skye. The Slate Peninsula, often called the Garden of Skye, has seen a remarkable reflowering in recent years. For Slate is one of several key areas in the Gaeltacht, which has actually seen its population increase for the first time in more than a century. Slate Primary is the fastest growing school in the Highlands. No sooner does it expand to cope with its growing pupil roll than further expansion is needed. Now there are more than 80 pupils here. A decade ago, there were fewer than 20. Many of the pupils come from out with the traditional Gaelic-speaking areas, indeed from outside Scotland. But with the approval of their parents, Gaelic is now an everyday part of the school curriculum. In the junior art class, Gaelic and English coexist perfectly happily. And in a district where a decade ago Gaelic was virtually dead, the language and culture of the Gael have struck new and apparently deep roots in Skye's traditional garden. Just a few miles down the road from Slate Primary is Sowell Moor Osteg, the first Gaelic centre of further education in the Gaeltacht, since the High Chiefs of Clan MacLeod founded a university for their sons on the Uists in 1200. And where Slate has one of the most vibrant primary schools in the Highlands, this Gaelic college, housed in a former stable, now attracts students from all over the Hebrides and beyond. The leading Gaelic poet, Sorley MacLean, is a regular lecturer here. But Sowell Moor Osteg is not only about the traditional high art of the Gael, poetry and literature. It has a strong department of computer studies, and business management classes are well attended. The only difference between this and colleges elsewhere in Britain is that classes are conducted entirely in Gaelic. The new town of Edinburgh, the heart of Scotland's banking establishment. These are the offices of merchant bankers Noble and Company.
Hello, Katrina. Just ringing you to ask...
Chairman Sir Ian Noble has business interests all over the world, in oil, whiskey and property.
There are 8 on the short lead, is that right? And, well, Scott Met will be tremendously pleased to hear that we're on it.
But the venture that takes up most of his time is a lot closer to home and seemingly to his heart. It's nothing less than the regeneration of the Slate Peninsula on Skye.
Hello, Barry. Give it a how. Ha mi gleva ha mi ddyrach chi yn fo elan iermens, rannig mit den agent mer ha.
The smooth switch from the language of big business to the language of the Gael belies the fact that Sir Ian is a self-taught Gaelic speaker. It's just one aspect of his determination to arrest the momentum of linguistic as well as economic decline on his Skye estate. Sir Ian's base on Skye is at Isle Ornsay, or Elang Irming as he prefers.
At Ferran Elan Irmen, as we call it, after 15 years or so, we've got a little over 30 of full-time, all-the-year-round staff. They're divided between a hotel and a farm, traditionally, a fish farm, a whiskey business, sort of a property type of business, and various other activities. The turnover has now reached a little bit over £1 million, which is quite exciting. It's beginning to look like a stable business, but it's taken much longer to put on its feet than I would have actually expected at the beginning.
Sir Ian, whose estate comprises around 26,000 acres of the traditional MacDonald clan lands, has been the catalyst for much of the revival on Slate. He was one of the founders of the Gaelic College, and the businesses he started have attracted returning Gaels as well as non-Gaels to the area. Sir Ian believes that what he is doing in Skye is the answer for much of the Gaeltacht, that somehow the Gael must be taught that his future depends on his economic viability, and that the culture and language can only be sustained from a healthy economic base.
What we want to get to now is an age where the Gaels become essentially entrepreneurs and businessmen. And then they don't have to worry about landowners and the poverty of agricultural land and marginal agriculture. But they can create commercial businesses which will be international in caliber and scale, as they are in the Faroes and in Iceland. And at that stage, the Gaels will be putting their foot on the face of the world's map in much the same way, perhaps, as the Jewish communities have, because they've always been interested in business. We've got to do something, and it may take centuries, to bring the Gaels into a mode where they see their role in the world as being not agriculture, because that dates from hundreds of years ago, but commerce and business and being successful in it.
But those with longer memories point to the ambitious plans of Lord Leverhulme in the 1920s to bring an economic solution to the Outer Isles. Lord Leverhulme's money came from soap powder. He had built a model village for his workers at Port Sunlight on the Lancashire coast, and similar philanthropic schemes had been initiated in places as far apart as Africa and South America.
But he understood that if you exploit a country's resources, you owe a duty to its people. For everything he took, he put something back.
Now he set his sights on Lewis and Harris. Lord Leverhulme's scheme was to attract the locals away from crofting and persuade them to work in a new fish processing business. The last thing Leverhulme wanted was a lot of crofters scattered throughout the island. He wanted his workforce living in the modern new houses he was building in Stornoway, readily available to work in his fish canning plant. But it was simply not the Hebridean way, and when from his base at Lewes Castle, Leverhulme started to buy up the larger, more fertile farms, the crofters reacted in what had by now become the time-honoured way, by reclaiming the land for themselves. Among those served with a summons as one of the land raiders at the township of Gress was George Stewart, at the time a boy of 14.
I think when I look back over 60 years now, I think if Lord Leverhulme had no opposition and had his schemes put forward, this island would have been more prosperous than what it was. I don't think the emigration of 1923 would have occurred at all.
Opposed at every turn by the very people he sought to help, Leverhulme abandoned his plans for Stornoway and moved instead to the island of Harris. But he was to find little more enthusiasm here, and the neglected pier at Leverborough is all that's left of the scheme that virtually bankrupted the once powerful soap king and drove him from the Hebrides, a heartbroken old man. Some see Sir Ian Noble as a latter-day Lord Leverhulme.
I'm a hell of a long way from having a broken heart. I don't think there's any comparison to Leverhulme. He didn't know what he was up against. I knew in a small way what some of the issues were, and they fascinated me. He did it as a kind of a rich man's dilettante dream.
The one thing the Highlands have never lacked have been rich men from outside with their own dreams about how to restore the region's former glories. The dream of Ellis MacDonald, a retired American stockbroker, has less to do with revitalizing the Highlands than restoring the fortunes of the fractured clan whose name he bears. And as part of that, he has led the drive to create Clan Donald Centre on the Isle of Skye. Ellis and his MacDonald fundraisers have injected around $4 million into the Slate Peninsula, the same area of Skye where Sir Ian Noble is based.
Many people have asked me what motivated me in the beginning and how I saw myself. Let me just say this. From the time of my very first memory, when I was 3 years old, my father brought me up to think of myself as a Highlander and a MacDonald. And that is part of me. It can't go away. It's as simple as that.
Apart from his personal fortune, Ellis married into the wealthy DuPont chemical family. The DuPonts have held the economic reins of power here in Delaware for generations.
Far frae my hame I wander, but still my thoughts return.
Only the Saltire flag of Scotland distinguishes Ellis's home from several other DuPont mansions in this area.
I see a cozy ingle.
But while their home is here in the rolling hills of Delaware, Ellis and his wife Rosa have lost at least part of their hearts to the Highlands of Scotland.
Angus. Angus and Heather.
And it's all but I'm longing for my
Easy, kids. No rough stuff.
Though they be but lonely pair or plain folk.
But for Ellis and Rosa, there is nothing sentimental about their love affair with Scotland and Clandonald. Ellis's grandfather emigrated from Glengarry to work as a clerk for the Hudson Bay Company during the last century. And Ellis has brought hard-headed American business methods to the worldwide fundraising efforts on behalf of his clan.
How many shares have we got in Glencoe?
6,749.
And we've already sold off, what, 3,000, was it? We sold off?
Yes. We've got a nice profit in that, though.
I know. But it always hurts when it goes up after you sell.
Absolutely.
Now virtually every MacDonald in North America is logged on the computer in the Clan Donald Trust offices here in the town of Wilmington. MacDonalds in Australia, New Zealand, and in countries around the globe are being added every day. Fundraising for Scotland's scattered premier clan is now big business and getting bigger.
We are heading for our best season yet.
Back in Scotland, this meeting of the Clan Donald Trust is attended by all the high chiefs of the clan. Godfrey, the Lord of the Isles, Glengarry, Clanranald, and other leading Scottish MacDonalds. But the meeting is chaired by Ellis, an American.
Third, we could perhaps put up a number of cottages in the Bull Park for a cost of approximately £240,000. And
clan centre at Armadale Castle on Skye has had the greatest financial input. But in addition, the Clan Trust has bought back about 17,000 acres of the traditional clan lands. More spending is expected, and about 70 new jobs have been created. Sir Ian Noble still owns most of the traditional MacDonald clan lands, lands which the Clandonald Trust would dearly love to recover. But in the short term, there's no denying the prosperity both groups have brought to Slate. But what of the future?
It scares me, but we do have enough reserve in the U.S. so that even if Rose and I drop dead, the deficit here will be picked up indefinitely.
But are there lessons here in Slate for the rest of the Gaeltacht? Or is the miracle of Slate really an illusion, with no more lasting relevance for the Highlands than earlier handouts from rich men, like Leverhume's largesse on Lewis and Harris? The removal at their own request of the entire population of St Kilda, the most distant of the Outer Hebrides in 1930, was to many symbolic of the apparent terminal decline into which the Gaeltacht had slipped. Demoralised by clearance, emigration and lack of leadership, one isolated community after another was giving up the fight and heading for the mainland. And while the Crofting Act of 1886 had stopped crofters being forcibly evicted, virtually nothing had been done to make more land available, to break up the huge private estates. In the present century, successive governments have grappled with the problems of the Highlands. The creation of the Forestry Commission, the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board, and ultimately the creation of the Highlands and Islands Development Board in 1965 have all contributed to the economy of the area, but still the population continued to drift away. For many, the answer lay in the ultimate control of the land. Rolf Rothmeyer's estate here at Ishkin at the south end of Lewis covers nearly 40,000 acres. Ishkin is famed for its venison, and during the land raids of the 20s, hundreds of deer were slaughtered here by the land-hungry crofters. Now there are no crofters left on Ishkin, which is given over largely to stalking by wealthy Europeans.
Hind on the left there.
Herr Rothmeyer, a Swiss businessman, also runs a thriving salmon farm. In his native Switzerland, it would be against the law for one man to own such a large landholding.
I think maybe that the British government one day has to do just the same as well, that they are sold out the land to foreign people. It's a great possibility here. But I mean, I would understand this point of view to tell foreign people not to be allowed to buy land here. I mean, I'm not here to take the land of the crofters. I'm not here to take the land of the Scottish people, the island people here. I want to help here to build up an economy what is viable.
But out of the land use question has come one of the most heartening developments since the passing of the first Crofting Act. Crofting, the mainstay of the Hebridean economy, has traditionally allowed a man to combine a bit of farming with fishing, as well as perhaps a seasonal or part-time job elsewhere. But in recent years, the crofters have formed their own union, which now has over 3,000 members. Many, like Frank Rennie, are incomers from other parts of Scotland and beyond. It's an infusion of new blood that appears to have brought a heightening of morale and a new sense of purpose to the Gaeltacht. There are now encouraging signs of people coming back to some of the islands which are the sorriest records of emigration.
There are over 200 people anyway in this village now. If you came here 70 years ago, there would have been nothing. None of these houses, none of these fields, it's all one big thing. None of the fences, all that is new. None of the families, none of the community. It's a myth to think of crofting as fighting a rearguard action. It's a very dynamic thing where people are actually wanting or choosing to come and do it. The guy next door on the road there's a weaver, guy up the road, civil engineer, guy across there's another weaver, a teacher, there's librarians, there's car mechanics, there's electricians, plumbers, all the different trades that are involved.
While Frank Rennie is one of the union's most articulate members, its chief executive and prime mover is Dr. Jim Hunter, a long-time advocate of crofter power.
We're seeing at the moment that if you make comparisons between crofting and other forms of agriculture elsewhere in the UK, that the amount of subsidy to crofting is actually very, very low. A big barley farmer, a cereal farmer in a place like East Anglia, or indeed even the east side of Scotland, is getting far, far more subsidy in the way of state support through the EEC and so on than any crofter is getting, or indeed any large number of crofters are getting. We're seeing now increasingly a tendency to think more in terms of keeping people in the countryside and how do you actually do that. And you don't do it by making farming more and more efficient in the traditional manner, by making units bigger, by increasing output. You do it by enabling people to combine a bit of farming with a bit of something else. In terms of that shift of emphasis, crofting suddenly begins to look not like something left over from the past, but actually the way to a better future, not just for these areas, but for other areas also.
But the Gaeltacht would not be the infuriatingly complex place it is if all agreed with this vision of the Gael as a small-scale entrepreneur. His problems have always been as much about filling an empty heart as filling an empty stomach. Powerful voices in Gaeldom are opposed to the notion of the Gael as a kind of Celtic yuppie.
Now, presumably Mrs. Thatcher admires these kind of people. This is the kind of, presumably, economy that she wants to operate. But the Highlander wouldn't admire these kind of people. And there is really no room in that kind of situation for the type that you get in the House of the Green Shutters or yuppie or people like that. That is, people who individualise themselves at all costs, want to make money for themselves. And these kind of people would not be liked. They would not be tolerated to any great extent.
There's really no reason historically why the Gaels should be exempt from the yuppiedom of the rest of the world. And I think it's one of the great hopes for the future of the Highlands in the present climate of individuality and entrepreneurship, which has made Scotland a place which has changed a lot, frankly, in the past decade. There's no reason to expect that the Highlands can't benefit tremendously from the old Gaelic individuality.
The crofting life was, I think, on the whole, a high quality of life because it set the human being at the centre, and rather than money or anything which was objective. And this quality of life, I think, has something to do with religion. And because the islands have been, I think, on the whole, religious and thinking a lot about death as well as life and a future life as well as this life, I think that has a great influence on the way they look at the world.
Tarbert, Isle of Harris. Around 200 people crowd into the local church for a service that yields nothing to fashion or the changing trends of Christianity elsewhere. Yet, church membership here in the Hebrides is higher than anywhere else in Britain. The theme of today's sermon is Christ's text that evil and freedom from sin emerge from a man's heart, not from the environment which has produced him.
Agus chunig mi, agus rein mi fianish, Guresho machye.
And many believe it's this conflict between the heart and the environment, between spiritual renewal and economic revival, that ultimately holds the key to the future of the Gael. The very name, the Outer Hebrides, suggests an existence on the margin, an elemental struggle between extinction and survival. This is Stornoway on the island of Lewis, a small town that is capital of Britain's largest local authority, the Western Isles. It is also the last bastion of the Gael, because from here there is literally nowhere else to go. With a history that predates the Norsemen, Stornoway still has the feel of a frontier town, an island community somehow trying to imitate urban life in a rural environment. And living in the Highlands today, Lays the Young is specially open to the contrast between the reality and the dream, between actually living on the edge and being tantalized through the medium of television and the press by an image of what life is supposed to be like at the center.
There's nothing here for me. I need an environment where I can change and develop, and I can't find it here. I'm kind of surrounded in cotton wool. There's so much outside this island. There's got to be more, and I want to find it.
There is not much in the way of jobs here. I think it's something ridiculous, like 26% unemployment here. And I'm not going to stay around. There isn't much here in Stornoway.
The young will go as the young have gone. But increasingly, perhaps instinctively, this generation knows that something important may not be there when or if they return.
There's something special about a community and a family here. It's kind of got this magic because, you know, it's so much related to the past.
I kind of feel left out when my friends are speaking Gaelic when we're together. I wish I'd learned it. It's a good language. It's quite fun when you hear them talking.
It's just such a lovely, lovely language.
It's associated with these islands.
Yeah. I mean, it's part of this island's culture. It's something that was always here. Personally, I think it would be just tragic if it was to die down.
Generations of Gaels have wrestled with the same conflicts, the guilt at leaving, the fear of staying. Many found oblivion, if not peace, in a bottle. And the Hebrides have some of the heaviest drinking in Britain.
What other people consider excessive is considered fairly normal in the Western Isles.
Well, I was away from the island for quite some time, but when I came back and started my own heavy drinking and got worse for me, I thought it was a terrible thing for myself, you know, a woman drinking.
It was the custom for the men to isolate themselves from the woman, certainly in the early part of the evening, and concentrate exclusively on drinking. And it was into this cult that I emerged in when I was 14 years of age, because I started drinking when I was 14.
We have premises made available to us which are used exclusively for Alcoholics Anonymous, and meetings are held there every night of the week, 7 nights a week. On a Saturday evening, there are 3 meetings going at the same time in separate rooms within that building. These are two meetings, just ordinary AA meetings, and a meeting of the young people's group of Alcoholics Anonymous in Stornoway.
Well, I'm just back from Benbecula, where I was brought up as a wee boy. It was very interesting. I was in Crigori Hotel. Oh, yeah, it's good crack, listening to all the old men boasting about their hangovers, you know. That's all they do, you know. I was listening to them. Oh, Donald Archie, you saying you've got a hangover. You said you were 5 days in the bed after your niece got married in the Lochshore and in Inverness. That's bugger all. You're an amateur. Last year, after New Year, I was dead for 6 months and I didn't know it.
So over the years, the image of the Gael has become a stereotype, one that is often perpetuated by the Gael himself.
Because there's a basic genetic difference between island males and Glaswegian males. All Glaswegian males walk as though they've got an aluminium keg between their legs. They go, how you doing? How big legs got, hey? How you doing, buddy? Now, West Coasters, like myself, we walk with what we call came pneumonia. We walk like that. How are you doing?
At worst, the Gael was drunken and unreliable. At best, he was otherworldly and at the same time parochial, but of course, always the Highland gentleman.
They even invented a special language for him, like they would say things like whatever and whenever. I never heard a Highlander ever saying whatever or whenever in my life. And this kind of Red Indian kind of language which they imposed on the Highlanders from outside, it was, they did look upon him in some sense as being someone who couldn't be taken seriously, who didn't belong to the real world where people worked.
The reality is that the culture and impact of the Gael have been expansive and dramatic at home and abroad. The Western Isles produce more university graduates per head of population than anywhere else in Britain. And the Gaelic language, despite being reduced to a rump of 80,000 speakers, remarkably continues to survive. But as the end of the 20th century looms, and as life in Liverpool and Los Angeles becomes more fraught, there is a growing consciousness that life on a remote croft in the Scottish Highlands has its own rewards. If life is just about survival, then survival in Skye is at least as acceptable as survival in Scunthorpe. But life, of course, is about more than mere survival. And here too, the Highlands of Scotland still have many advantages. A sense of history, a culture and language separate from the rest of Britain, and a deep-seated religious questioning of the very reason for living. But in more practical terms, it also has unexpected and untapped resources in its lochs, its seas, and in its wild, only seemingly barren terrain. The setting up of the Highlands and Islands Development Board saw central government for the first time recognising that the north and far west of Scotland did have special problems requiring special solutions. Inevitably, given the nature and history of the patient, many of the board's cures over the years were criticised. Some simply didn't work, but especially in recent years, and helped by large-scale funding from the EEC, the economy has shown encouraging signs of rebirth. Crofting has begun to revive, and there have been major developments in fish farming and other seafood industries.
I think the board has been seen as something of a centralised bureaucracy stemming from Inverness, with people coming out for a day or two to sort out the Highlands, so to speak. I think now, much more, we have local people actually working from local offices, and that helps to generate small applications from, if you like, the smaller people working in these areas. And we've seen much more small cases coming forward. That's been very good news.
Throughout the Hebrides, the old black houses have largely given way to bungalows, and as the population drift has been arrested, a brand new senior school has been built here on Benbecula, only the second ever built in the Outer Hebrides. For generations, the rhythm of life in the Outer Hebrides has been tuned to the clacking of looms, often in outhouses and sheds, and in the most remote places. Long before the Highland Board, Harris Tweed and Glóherach provided a living and helped knit together the scattered island communities, often when it seemed the whole social fabric of the area was coming apart. Now Japanese and Americans fight for the privilege of wearing Nglaumor, the great cloth. These days, it's mostly handlooms weaving factory-produced yarn. But there are still some who prefer to do things the traditional way, like May Campbell. Hers must be the best-known croft in Harris, as hundreds of tourists stop by each year to order one of her unique handmade tweeds. But while Harris tweed remains the biggest single industry in the Gaeltacht, there is still huge potential in the waters around the coast, which teem with fish. But as ever, the problem is whether the Gael really sees himself as an entrepreneur.
I think the Western Isles have a way of life which has many good things going for it, but it does not include the kind of thrusting desire to do better than your neighbour and do him down, so to speak. And this, I think, affects the motivation. Certainly true that East Coast boats and Shetland boats will earn 50% perhaps more than a boat from the Western Isles on average, sometimes even more than that. But it is a fact of life.
Expectations have been raised only to be dashed so often in the past. But there is a growing belief that a new day may yet be dawning for the Highlands and Islands. It's partly to do with leadership. Many of those who previously left are now coming home to stay, but it's also to do with the changing face of the world itself, of industry internationally. With modern communications just a touch of a button away, computer-based industries can as easily be sited in Lewis as in Lewisham. But if the clearances were the direct consequences of the economic philosophy of the 18th and 19th centuries, who knows what is being spiritually cleared from the heart of the Gael as a consequence of the technocratic philosophy of the late 20th century.
Our parents wanted us to become successful in the outside world and become, if you like, the equivalent of today's yuppies in some sense, and yet to remain with them. And the sad thing about that was that split us down the middle, because it wasn't economically and socially possible when we were a bit younger to actually achieve that sort of situation, to be both kind of trendy and successful and a Gael.
The Highlands of Scotland today, as I see it, speaking after having lived overseas for 10 years, is a place where optimism is the prevailing keynote. All one has to do now, as I've been doing for the past few weeks, is drive through Skye or Lewis or Harris or Uist or Barra and look at the way the great house building of the past decade and a half have affected the landscape. And you know for sure that the people who are building those houses are not poor people. And you know that there is underpinning Gaelic society in the Highlands today a confidence and an economic base which wasn't there a couple of decades ago.
So much then for the economic new dawn. But what of the language and culture? Ultimately, the qualities that have set the Gael apart. Here surely is the community's real test of regeneration. Indeed, some in this deeply religious land question whether the Almighty himself now sees Gaelic as beyond redemption.
If, in my humble view, the Lord intended Gaelic to be used as the medium of communicating the gospel into the future, then he would have raised up. After all, he's the Lord of the harvest, and we're to pray to him to send forth labourers into his own harvest. And the fact is that he is not sending out labourers, Gaelic-speaking labourers, into his harvest. And I must draw the conclusion, this is only a personal opinion, I must draw the conclusion that it's not his will that Gaelic survive as a language.
The Lord is still with the Gaelic culture as far as we're concerned. And so long as we have even a small number of Gaelic speakers go to, I think, to meet their needs in their own language. Again, it goes back to the same problem that this is what they understand, this is what their heart wants, and they must get the gospel in the language of their own hearts, in my view.
Two men sharing a common surname, a common religion, and a common culture, yet with totally opposing views on the validity of their native tongue, and perhaps even the very basis of their faith. 'Twas ever thus in the Gaeltach. And in a world in which each part increasingly has to justify its own existence, it seems it is not enough for Gaelic to exist without continuously having to justify its existence. The annual Gaelic Mod, a week-long celebration of the poetry and music of the Gael.
Competitor number 9, please. Seamus Rory McGonigal, North Carolina.
For the first time ever, an American Gael takes part in one of the solo singing competitions. For Jamie MacDonald, a descendant of MacDonalds cleared from Slate to the Carolinas, to perform in the language of his people at their premier festival is the realization of a lifelong ambition. Sometimes it's easier to recognize what's important from a distance, even from 3,000 miles across the Atlantic. And many feel that the true potential of the exiles has yet to be tapped.
Just think what the emigrants could do if they started getting together again. Now, there was a Fashniok, a prophecy which Marty Vore sang about, when all of us people started coming back, and I think to some extent we've started. Conyahoa, the Brahan Seer, in the days of the Black Rains, saw the clansfolk coming back to regain the lands of their ancestors. So perhaps what the Gaels and the Scots need to do is to utilise this great resource in the Scottish diaspora, in Gaeldom overseas, and there is Gaeldom overseas.
If somebody says, what does it matter now that the clans no longer live in the glens, I would say, what does anything matter? What is tradition for? What is your blood for? You look at dogs, horses, and blood counts. Why should humans be different? I think blood counts.
So the seed that was planted on the Machar of Iona 1,500 years ago has grown into an international flower. Here and there in the West Highlands of Scotland, it still blooms sweetly, its colours bright and seductive. But the key question remains, how long can the petals bloom without the sap? If Gaelic continues to decline, how long can the culture survive without the language at its heart?
one can see in recent years amongst Gaelic speakers and amongst people who have taken up an interest in Gaelic language, that there is a growing level of grassroots, groundswell, demand for provision for the language. Something perhaps in which almost 100 years of uncommon Gaelach there hasn't been until now.
I think it's interesting that Gaels in places like Glasgow and in Edinburgh and in Inverness, for a start now, feel confident enough to put their children to Gaelic medium playgroups and into Gaelic medium education and so on. Must be that they're beginning to feel a bit happy about being both Gaels and city dwellers.
What we're doing at the Gaelic College, what we're doing in the schools, what we're doing through various projects, the island's got lots of them, so have the Western Isles, aren't just idiosyncratic things. They are all part of a partial of a plan to encourage, to stimulate, so that at the end of the day, these young people will carry the ideas forward to fruition. I think that's where the work has got to be done, not simply in romanticising of the past or lamenting the past, but ensuring that our young folk aren't just in a situation where they must have a future, but where they are creating their own future, and language is part of that.
If
the Gaelic culture had produced nothing else in the past century but the poet Sorley MacLean, then in the view of many critics, its contribution to 20th century European life and literature would still have been hugely significant. Out of a painful love affair of his own emerged one of Sorley MacLean's greatest works, Guð na Harpa. The prophetic cry of Europe, written half a century ago, is a love poem about a beautiful yellow-haired woman that might otherwise be called Gaelic. A girl loved for her beauty, strength and innocence, living on the edge of a continent which would know only ugliness and brutality as the first half of the 20th century unfolded.
In the anachol voyar haum voyar voy, found of the oils is gurn a harpa, girl of the yellow, heavy yellow, gold yellow hair, the song of your mouth and Europe's shivering cry. Fair, heavy-haired, spirited, beautiful girl, the disgrace of our day would not be bitter in your kiss. And ook a korp gallas Clark grain of worms a kawakarach guna braina, with white body and forehead sun take from me the foul black treacheries, spite of the bourgeois and poison of their creed, and the feebleness of our dismal Scotland. Take ach cuach yet chual orvo irishgach boch in your story. But every lock of your gold yellow head to all the poverty, anguish and grief that will come and have come on Europe's people, from the slave ship to the slavery of the whole people.
Now, in the final years of that same century, the once beautiful girl that is Gaelic seeks to be loved, perhaps as much for her imperfections as for her flawlessness, as much for her frailty as for her strength. Sorley MacLean's cry for Europe was and is the cry of the individual. It's a cry for freedom and for survival, a plea that to be different is not to be inferior. And that cry from this historically tortuous corner of Europe is not just by the Gael, for the Gael, but for minority cultures everywhere. It's the cry of humanity for the full expression of its humanity.
Marini